my my father had to believe what his mother taught him. And again, it was that women are worthless and you should kill your daughters. They're only allowed, this is northern Italy, and I have since found out, since I've been traveling, I found out that a lot of people believe that people in northern Italy are vampires and or werewolves. I've heard vampires and werewolves, and they're disgusting. I don't know about that. There are very few northern Italian people in this country. But what happens, according to Rita, if you're born into a satanic cult, you are always in the satanic cult. And it might be generations later of people who have distanced themselves from the cult, but they have the same, they use the same parenting tips that their parents did. So the rule in northern Italy was you should kill your baby girls, and so your firstborn that you let live is a boy, and then you can let one of your girls live after that, and then you have to kill the rest until you have a boy, and then you can keep a girl if you have another girl. The spacing that my grandparents had was that my father was 25 years older than his brother, and didn't seem to realize that his brother was in fact his son. My grandfather agreed to that bizarre and disgusting behavior because she agreed to allow him to have a mistress and spend his money on his mistress rather than his family. What my father did was he spent a little bit more than half his money on his mistress and half his money on us. Luckily, I was very good at figuring out commercials, and my father was in Madison Avenue, so he kept getting promoted, and I believe by the time I was 17, he was making $120,000 a year. Now, this is a time when if you made $10,000 a year, you were, middle class. So he was doing very well. So we lived on $60,000, which is still pretty rich. We're upper middle class, I believe. And you look at his family and you see just the most adorable family. My grandmother she cooked all the time and was a food pusher. If you went into her house, she would insist that you eat. And you could tell her till the cows came home that you weren't hungry, and she would go into the kitchen and start cooking like a dinner for you. And it was kind of annoying and kind of cute at the same time. And my grandfather just kind of toddled around, and he was very handy around the house, and gardening. He liked gardening, so he was, the Italian gardener, which is a pretty common sight. And you would never guess that they were mass murderers. So what my father used to do, well, I don't know whether I'll tell you the particulars of how they killed their little girls, but the first I had an inkling that something was going wrong was they recounted coming to America, and it turned out 6 months later they had my Aunt Terry. So my grandfather knew that Terry was not his because she was like 8 pounds and fully developed when she was born. But my grandmother thought that my grandfather was the father, because my father, who was the actual father of Terry, was only 10 when they came over, and that's a little bit young to be growing sperm. Evidently, you can have an erection and an ejaculation and no sperm when you're younger. But he had the sperm. I guess if you are sexually active, your body will do things to try to catch up. So my grandfather used to sexually molest Terry since she wasn't his, and they just felt that they could do whatever they wanted to their little girls because they were little girls and they're not going to be worth anything. And then years later, probably 10 to 15 years later, my father fathered my uncle. And the reason why he lived was that he was breech, and my father was out on his first date with my mother, and they had to wait for him to come home with the car. He didn't even realize she had been pregnant. He thought she had been gaining weight. This is how completely withdrawn he was from reality by that time. And so they had my uncle, who experienced the same abuse as I did. My mother had had an affair with her brother's wife's brother, and she thought I was his, and so she hated me for that because I was a reminder of her sin. So she tried to kill me dozens and dozens of times, and I can remember some of the times. One time she put me out of a taxi in the middle of Times Square, hoping at Christmas time, hoping that somebody would run me over. And that's why car manufacturers came up with child-proof locks. But I was 6 months old. I wouldn't have been able to open the lock myself, the story was that I opened the lock and the door, and my sister, who was 3.5 years older than me, pushed me out of the cab, and that's what both my parents stuck to that story. The cab driver knew differently, and the guy behind us who stopped for me, he could see my mother's hands placing me onto the street. So he knew differently, but back then, you could kill your kid, I think. There was no such thing as child abuse laws. Your kids were your property. And up until that time, your wife was your property. But things started to change once I was born. And that is how a lot of people who are boys who are sexually abused feel about women. And that's why. Because it is the mother, who is a woman, tells them these horrible stories about women, and and they believe it. Now, I think that you can get your child to believe pretty much anything if you beat them, you put them down, but it seems to me that the worst abuse is sexual abuse, and it seems to be the most damaging to men. And the men don't figure out that their mother is a woman and should not be feeling these feelings against women. They must have a certain amount of self-loathing to do this to their sons, but it's not good. It's not good. So you would never really know that for my family that my father was so crazy, a mass murderer, and my mother was, stepping out on him from time to time, which I suspected. But what I didn't know was that my father never had to go to work. He had an office, a nice office, evidently, that we were never allowed to visit on Madison Avenue. He worked for Dancer, Fitzgerald, and Sample, which was the third largest advertising agency in the world. BBD&O was the largest, and then there was another one that I can't remember, and then was Dancer, Fitzgerald, and Sample. They don't exist anymore, and I think Sample is the only one who kept the company going. So, we, on the surface, we looked like this wonderful family. I mean, a family that you would be jealous of. And my father he didn't kill any of his girls. And he liked the fact that people would say, "Oh, what pretty little girls you have." He liked that. And, but in the meantime, we had to be in bed before he got home because he didn't want to have to hear us. He wasn't allowed. Now, once you're in your 30s, what your father beat you up for when you were 7, you have to rethink that's a flawed view. Your father who has a mistress that's not good, and who tells you how to treat women it's just ludicrous. So evidently my grandmother had a job during the Depression, and my grandfather couldn't find work, so he went out every day, but he went just down the street to his mistress's house, like he was going to work, or he would say he's trying to find work. So my grandmother was the breadwinner, and my grandfather wouldn't touch her sexually. So she sexually abused her oldest son, Santo, my father, and she even sexually abused her daughters. And my Aunt Terry, who you could tell was a little bit not flaky, but you could tell she was emotionally disturbed. She was very nice, and she had a family. She had a boy, a girl, and another boy, and that was it. And I think that the man she was married to found out that she had killed some of the little girls that she had, and he broke up with her. So nobody was stopping this cycle of abuse. And then I was given to my grandmother, who said to my father that she wanted to get to know me better and could I spend the night. Now my father knew she was a child molester, and he said okay. So I found myself sleeping over at my grandparents on their pull-out couch, and one morning my grandmother came in, and while I was still asleep, she brought me a cup of coffee with whiskey, mostly whiskey, probably half and half. And she put her hand on my crotch and started to molest me. And I woke up and knocked the cup of coffee on her and burned her. And that stopped her. And I jumped up and I ran into the bathroom, locked the door, and I yelled at her I wouldn't come out until she promised she wouldn't do that again. So that story of me, when she tried to molest me, of me burning her with coffee, was only partly true. The burning her with coffee part was just my angels, or it was an accident as far as I was concerned, but it did stop her. And she related to her daughters, and then her son Davy, who's only 5 years older than me, 4 or 5 years older than me, my uncle. He said when she came at him to try to have sex with him, he ran off and yelled at her that he would tell Linny on he would tell Linny on her. Now, my name was Lynn, and when I was younger, my family called me Linny. I don't like either name. That's my slave name, and I don't associate with that name anymore. But then he said he realized that he was 12 or so I would have been about 7, and that if a 7-year-old could stop her, a 7-year-old girl could stop her, then he would be able to stop her too. And things started to change, but my grandmother complained to my grandfather, who was the disciplinarian, and he beat Davy up and said, I think sent him to the hospital. And if he told anybody that it was him that did it, that he would kill him, and that this should teach him a lesson, that he should listen to his mother and do whatever his mother wants. And so he was trapped by a father who knew that he wasn't his, and made fun of him for it, like he could do anything about it. Same thing with my mother. She would always beat me and tell me that was, that I reminded her of her sin, and how I wasn't hers, and my father didn't feel that I was his, and I was treated way worse than a dog. So a couple of times people would offer to adopt me, and my parents were fine with that, but both times the mooks killed the person who wanted to adopt me, so that I had to stay with the abusive family, who didn't really want me, and they really didn't even care. I would get routinely abducted from the time I was 2 or 3, and my mother would never call the cops, and she just knew that I would be back sooner or later. And then, but she felt that that was a relief, that she didn't have to take care of me for that amount of time. And so she never bothered to stop it or question it or anything. One time, I figured out how to do cartwheels in a straight line where you could. I was very athletic when I was a kid. And I could go 30 miles an hour doing cartwheels, and my arms, my hands, and my feet barely touched the ground. They were only on the ground for a split second. So, like, nothing hurt. Like, my legs wouldn't hurt, my hands wouldn't hurt, my arms wouldn't hurt, because I would do these wild, really fast cartwheels. And I'm sure if I could do it, anybody could do it. So the things I do physically that people think are astonishing, I believe that anybody could do them if they tried. They just don't try. So in front of a lot of people who were watching me do these cartwheels, a car drove up, and the people abducted me right in front of everybody and put me in the car. When the people in the neighborhood went and told my mother, she just said, well, she'll be back. And she wasn't going to call the cops. So some of the older, the other mothers in the neighborhood got together and said, she's not going to call the cops, we will. So they called the cops, and when I got back, I could hear my mother saying, she's my child, I can do what I want with her. She would always say that. If I don't want to call the police, I don't have to. She always comes back. And so the cops were like, this has happened before? And she said, yes, it happens a lot. And they said, and you don't do anything to stop it, and you don't call the police or anything? And she's, no, I know, I don't care. I hate her. So the police, when I showed back up, felt real sorry for me. But there's nothing that they could do. It wasn't her who abducted me, and I did come back, and I couldn't remember where I'd been or what I'd done. And, back then I don't think anybody ever checked to see if you'd been raped or anything, which is probably what happened. And it used to happen quite a bit. When I was very, very little, I was raped, and then I would bleed so much that I would bleed out. So I learned to ask for water, and I would just keep drinking water until the bleeding stopped. And if you drink water, whatever fluid you need in your body will make it immediately. So I recommend that if you're bleeding real heavily. Drink a lot of water until you get medical attention, or you don't even really need medical attention, because your body does heal itself if you just concentrate. So there's two families who seem really normal on the outside, very normal, to the point of being enviable on the outside. But on the inside, there was so many levels of abuse that it boggles your mind. So when I wasn't being tortured by the cult, I was being beaten up by my mother. She tried to electrocute me a couple of times. She tried to drown me several times. She put me out in the snow one time, but then somebody found me. I was a baby, and the snow was up to like my waist, so I couldn't walk in it. And I guess I was almost frozen when somebody found me finally. She'd bring me into the woods and leave me in the woods. She'd bring me into stores and leave me in the stores. And somehow I would always find my way back home. And like I said, you know, if that were nowadays, she'd be in jail. But back then that was normal. You could do that to your child. That was fine. So the point is that even though and the child called it, like there was this book called The Child Called It, and he was one child in the whole family who was being severely abused. And the mother would do it without the other children watching. Same thing with me. My mother would tell me things, you know, how much she hated me and she wanted to kill me and things like that when my sisters were not around. And my sisters were not allowed to talk to me. So I had this built-in support group, but they weren't allowed to talk to me. They would talk to me, you know, when we were alone in our bedroom, we shared a bedroom, stuff like that. Then they would talk to me, but they weren't allowed when my mother was around to talk to me. So that made that part of my life really, really hard. And it seems like, you know, I had this really terrific childhood. You know, I was in all these movies. But again, I didn't get paid for them. I would always be abused. I would be tortured to forget them. And, you know, so I was kind of sickly a lot of times. And I'd be brought onto the airplane in a wheelchair and drugged. And often enough that the flight attendants were able to recognize me and realize after a while that I wasn't getting better and I wasn't dying. I was just always slumped in this wheelchair, and even the flight attendants would question that. So I don't have a childhood that I can look back fondly on. And this can happen, this kind of thing, not to that degree, I don't think, but it can happen to anyone who this crime syndicate feels like they could benefit from. Now, Rita told me that I was the one in their legends who would save the world. And that's why they had to keep real close eye on me, and that's why they had to own me, so that they wouldn't allow me to save the world. They want to destroy the world. Fun stuff, huh?